The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the honourable member for Wakefield.
Well, thank you, Deputy Speaker. And this bill is just one piece in the government's strategy to effectively abolish Medicare, effectively destroy this very important system of universal health care, which was put in by the Hawke government and is part of course, the Labor Party's DNA to protect it, to advance it. It's something that's beloved by all Australians, and we know that this government is absolutely determined to destroy it. Now, in this regard, the Abbott government is channelling the ideas of earlier incarnations of John Howard, and of course we heard the previous speaker, the member for Boothby, talking a bit about history and about these things. And of course we know that John Howard in 1987 said that Medicare was a total disaster, that he promised it that we'll pull it right apart, and he said that they get rid of bulk billing. And we know that the member for Mayo was a learned staffer of Mr Howard's and helped to be the architect of work choices. I won't go into details here, obviously, on this bill. It would be unfair to the member for Mayo to do so. And I'm indebted to Julia Gillard because she wrote an excellent article in the Abbott Foundation, where she recorded, of course, Mr Howard's other words about Medicare, where he called it a miserable, cruel fraud, a scandal, a total incomplete failure, a quagmire, a total disaster, a financial monster and a human nightmare. And I believe he also, for the member for Mayo's benefit, I think he also threatened to take a scalpel to Medicare. So that was the early incarnation of John Howard, and we know Mr Howard's views were important because so many on that side of the House, and the government side of the House, regard him as an ideological figure, if not a mentor. I know the member for Mayo does. It is a great pity that none of them have the courage of Mr Howard. None of them have the courage of Mr Howard at that time. At least Mr Howard was honest with the Australian people about his intentions towards Medicare. He was honest about them. And later, when he recanted all those views in 1995 and 1996 to win an election, he basically stuck to it. But we know that this government want to tear apart Medicare, absolutely rip it to shreds, but at the same time they want to use this Orwellian language that they're the best friend Medicare ever had, and then you have the health minister getting up here and talking about free services, even though people pay a Medicare levy. They pay it every year through the tax system to pay for those services, to make the system of universal health care sustainable, to make it a system that is financially viable. And then we hear the government rolling out this language of that it's unsustainable, that it's free, all these sorts of things, never sort of pausing to wonder about the irony that they're then taking those proceeds and putting them into a separate fund. So it's not like this is a deficit reduction measure or anything about going back into Medicare. It's all going off into a research fund, and research is worthwhile. But you've got to question the government's intentions when they tell us it's about sustainability on one hand and then they're putting the proceeds of it in a locked box on the other. And I heard the member for Bowman earlier talking about how they were forced to do it, that they've been forced into this situation. They've been forced in this bill to embark on a tax on medicines, a $1.3 billion tax that will hurt consumers. Not about the sustainability of the system, not about the sustainability of the system at all, but rather about taking savings and putting them somewhere else. And so this is not about sustainability, which must be a line out of the focus groups. It's about ideology. It's about the ideology of destroying Medicare. That's what this government intends to do. And we can see it in their GP tax, and I've spoken to the House a couple of times today about the GP tax, about this cascading tax, this compounding tax, $7 every time you head into the waiting room, $7 every time you get a blood test. If you have to go back to the doctor, to check up on conditions, if you've got pneumonia, maybe you have to visit the doctor 6 times, $7 every time you get into that waiting room. And that must be terrifying so many families particularly families in my electorate and across working and middle-class Australia, who really do feel those out-of-pocket expenses, really do feel them. And this is coming on top of $80 billion worth of cuts to schools and hospitals, $50 billion in hospitals alone. And we know the effects of those. We know the effects of $50 billion worth of cuts. More than it's the equivalent to 4,300 hospital beds. It's the equivalent to more than 25,000 nurses. It's the equivalent of some 12,000 doctors over 7 years. So these cuts are extraordinary, And I know that state governments, both Liberal and Labor, I think the New South Wales Premier called it a kick in the guts. I know that the Premier of my state and the Treasurer of my state have been feeling the burden when they came to do the state budget of the cuts of this government. And it's all about establishing a two-tiered healthcare system, an American system. This is, really the way they've always wanted to head. They want to basically establish what the Americans are trying to get away from. And we had Professor Stiglitz in the country wisely advocating that why would you want to copy a system which does not have universality at its core, which places a huge economic and financial burdens on working and middle-class Australians, and which undermines the equity of your nation. And it's something that's absolutely critical to the Australian character, particularly the modern Australian character, the idea of a fair go, this idea that's been around since Federation, particularly important these days when we do get such extremes in wealth. We know that healthcare is one of those areas that you don't want to tie your income to your ability to access healthcare. And we know that the government is slowly but surely, with their $7 GP tax, with this $1.3 billion tax on pharmaceuticals, that's the system that they want to institute. Now, of course, it's opposed by the AMA, and we know what they said about their co-payment. The AMA, in one of their press releases on the 15th of the 5th, the federal government's move to impose a co-payment for GP visits will deter people from seeking necessary medical care and could leave doctors $13 out of pocket if they waive the charge for the parents, the AMA has warned. And we know that that's a really, really important fact, that the doctors are telling the government, desperately telling the government, that this is going to hurt primary health care, which begins with the GPs. It begins at those general practices. And of course, I've already read this letter out, but Dr Bruce Groves from Salisbury North talks about the GP tax. He says this about it: the measure is heartless, bereft of social conscience, and punishes those who can least afford it. There is a good doctor, Dr Bruce Groves, who runs an important practice in Salisbury North, which is it's a working class suburb. They have a lot of people on fixed incomes, pensioners and the like, who are very, very confused and upset, fearful of what the government wants to do, not just on the PBS, but on the GP tax as well. And we know the devastating effects that Dr Groves's practice felt when the GP tax was announced. He recorded a 30% drop in attendance. A 30% drop in attendance. And if you talk to anybody in Elizabeth, who's been to the clinic on Phillip Highway, which I have, I got a text message through my phone. I haven't been there for a while, but I got a text message from the GP clinic saying that the $7 GP tax didn't apply, and it was business as usual for bulk billing. And the reason why they're sending out these texts to their patient, to their customer base, is because they're feeling this effect already, this chilling effect of the government's determination to destroy Medicare. Now, Labor's way has been to use price disclosure, to use those savings, as the member for Bendigo quite rightly pointed out before, to use that price disclosure to fund PBS. In effect, to channel the savings that a government might make back into the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. And that is the appropriate way of running your health system. The Liberal way is to pile on the costs, pile on the burdens on the working and middle-class families, and then shift the money sideways. A sort of cruel pea and thimble trick, a vicious attack on working and middle-class families, sort of a game of three-card Monty, you know, and someone in those sorts of card games always gets ripped off. It's a sort of an attempt, I think, to place Australian families at a detriment without being honest about it. And as I said before, the government's language in this regard is completely aimed to give reassurance where there should be none. There should be none, and they're not being completely straight with the Australian people about their intentions to destroy Medicare. Now, we know the Prime Minister, of course, has a great deal of form in this regard, And, of course, when he was Health Minister, I had a bit of a quick look at the internet before, because I cast my mind back to the days when he was Health Minister, and of course on the AM program on the Saturday 16th of April 2005, it was recorded in a story, Abbott apologises for safety net backflip. And it begins with Elizabeth Jackson. She began the show with, "The embattled Federal Health Minister Tony Abbott says he understands why there are loud calls today for his resignation in the wake of the government's decision to raise the Medicare safety net." So there's another example, I suppose, of the government's and the Prime Minister's commitment back then when he was Health Minister. And of course, he then promised one thing before an election and then had to sort of creep out of cabinet once they were re-elected in 2005. Creep out of cabinet with his tail between his legs, contemplating resignation but not actually having the courage to do it. And of course, Mr Nick Grimm, in the same interview, put it to him, "But you must have been lying at the time when you referred to the cast iron guarantee, or you were hoping that the government would go along with the blowout." That's what Mr Grimm put to Mr Abbott. Mr Abbott said, "The statement," and then there's a pause, we're used to the Prime Minister's pauses, "the statement I made back then was the absolute truth to the best of my knowledge and belief at the time. But since the election, the government has obviously been reconsidering the matter. Since the election, the government has been looking at the blowout, not just in the short term but in the long term, and responsible governments do not make commitments that turn out to be unsustainable." Well, there you go. So the Prime Minister's got form. He's got form. And when on the Friday, the 22nd of July 2011, it was put to him that his 2004 broken promise would give the Australian people some misgivings, because he had given absolutely rock-solid, ironclad commitment. That's what he had said about the Medicare safety net. And in 2005 he said, "When I made that statement in the election campaign, I had not the slightest inkling that there would ever be an intention to change this. But obviously when circumstances change, governments do change their opinions." Now, he went on to, a bit of verbiage about how that was then and this is now, and people should be completely trusting of him as opposition leader. And of course, what do we get when he's Prime Minister? Well, we get $80 billion worth of cuts, which he did not talk about before the election. We get commitments to pensioners, which were not fulfilled at all. And of course, we now know how betrayed those pensioners feel. And of course, we had not one mention of the $7 cascading co-payment, the $7 GP tax that applies every time you sort of waltz through a waiting room or get a blood test and the like. Not one mention of that during the election campaign. We know he made commitments about Medicare locals, which he's now broken. So broken promises on savings, about schools and hospitals, broken promises on pensions, broken promises on the GP tax and things like the Medicare locals. And one must, when you look at the form of the Prime Minister, both as Health Minister and now as Prime Minister, you've got to say he had all the sincerity of a riverboat gambler. And that's the character of this government. It is a terrible character of the government. And I'll just finish on this note. Mr Dutton in the MPI said the Australian people know in their hearts and in their minds that only a Liberal government, only a coalition government that will strengthen Medicare for generations to come. I mean, there has been no greater chicanery uttered in this parliament than that by this Health Minister. They intend to tear Medicare limb from limb, to take a scalpel to it. It's just in their DNA. That's what they intend to do, and we'll be carrying the fight up every day to the election, along with the 67,000 Australians who have signed the petition to save Medicare. There will be many, many more. And the next election will be a referendum on Medicare.
Order. The member's time has expired.